Welcome to the first module of a three-part series on parent-centered planning for parents with disabilities. This is part one, which is the current state of the research on working with parents with disabilities. My name is Elizabeth Lightfoot, and I am a professor at the School of Social Work at the University of Minnesota. And this module series is hosted by the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare, which is also at the School of Social Work at the University of Minnesota. And I would like to acknowledge two of the other funders of my research related to this module series, most notably the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, which has funded my research on parent-centered planning through the National Research Center for Parents with Disabilities, which is at Brandeis University. The other funder is the Minnesota Agricultural Experiment Station, which has funded a number of my studies related to parents with disabilities in the child welfare system. This is a three-part module series. Part one, this module is on the current state of research on working with parents with disabilities. Modules 2 and Module 3 are focused on parent-centered planning. Module 2 is focused on the roots of parent-centered planning in the person-centered planning model. And Module 3 is about the parent-centered planning brief intervention. In this module, first I'll give a brief background of the situation of parents with disabilities, and then I'll go over evidence and promising practices in working with parents with disabilities. There's new main types of promising practices that have research base, and those are related to parent skill development and improving social connections and social supports. And then I'll conclude with covering some of the practice considerations for working with parents with disabilities, particularly for those working in the child welfare system. So I'll start off first with a brief background. So in the early 20th century in the United States, people with disabilities were routinely sterilized involuntarily. So they were sterilized against their will without their consent. This practice was formalized into state law. The first state law allowing involuntary sterilization of people with disabilities was passed in 1907 in Indiana, and a number of states followed suit, culminating with Virginia, which passed a law allowing for involuntary sterilization in 1924. This Virginia law led to a famous Supreme Court case, which was called Buck versus Bell in 1927. This is a photo of Carrie Buck on the left and her mother, Ella, on the right. The Supreme Court ruled that it was constitutional to involuntarily sterilize the unfit, and in this case, they're referring to Carrie Bell of Virginia. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the famous Supreme Court justice, in support of his argument that the interest of public welfare outweighs the interest of individuals in their bodily integrity, argued, and this is a direct quote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, unquote. In the decade that followed this landmark 1927 Supreme Court decision, there were 28,000 people sterilized against their will because of a disability, including 8,000 in Virginia alone. While the practice of involuntary sterilization sort of withered out during the 50s and 60s, it morphed into a common practice of mothers with disabilities having their babies removed from them at birth, often at the hospital, based on their disability, or parents with disabilities becoming involved in the child welfare system and often losing their children to the child protection system based primarily on their disability. This still happens today. Over a decade ago, we did a study of state policies where we found that a large number of states had disability-related grounds for termination of parental rights. 3/4 of the states had these disability-related grounds, and the vast majority of these states used outdated terminology, used imprecise definitions, and emphasized conditions such as the person's disability rather than their behavior, such as their actual parenting behaviors. There has been some improvement since we first highlighted the issues in these state laws, and you can go to the website at Brandeis University that lists some of the newest changes in state laws, so there has been some progress here. So we published this as a policy research brief and a research article, and all of the resources that I'm showing you in this module or the other two modules, you can find in the resource guide that's on the main page of this module series. So all of the link bibliography with all the articles are all included there. We also completed a study looking to the foster care record system. And this was about 5 years ago. And we found that parental disability is listed by child welfare agencies as a removal reason for removing a child from his or her parents in 19% of all cases of kids in foster care. So, of kids in foster care, 19% had parental disability listed as a removal reason. 5% of them had parental disability as the only reason listed in their foster care records that they were removed. Additional 14%, it was parental disability or another reason. These are the other reasons that were listed when parental disability was listed as well. And this varied radically by states, where some states, such as Ohio, which was the highest, used parental disability as a removal reason for over half of their cases in the child welfare system, while other states had it as less than 1%, such as Illinois, which was only 0.7% used parental disability as a removal reason. And this shows how uneven the states are in reporting parental disability in general. And that's because the states don't have any strong requirement that they keep records on how many of the kids in the child welfare system have a parent who has a disability. So parental disability is not recorded standardly. That said, with these caveats, we found that it was used often, and the kids of parents who had a disability listed were more likely to remain in foster care longer and less likely to have a goal of family reunification. And you can read more about this study in this article that you can find in our resource guide. Some of this research that I just presented to you was included in the National Council on Disabilities Rocking the Cradle report, which replicated our state statute study. And in this National Council on Disability report published in 2012, they asserted that disability alone should not be used as grounds for termination of parental rights. And they also suggested that parental support should be taken into account. There's currently few formal sources of support to assist parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities or other types of disabilities, but these are starting to grow. After the National Council on Disability released this report, there was a lot of media attention. There was newspaper articles and radio stories and TV reports that covered this Rocking the Cradle report and highlighted the issues that parents with disabilities were facing. And all of this attention has led to some changes in the state laws for parents with disabilities. So some states now are requiring supportive services in child welfare statutes. It's not the norm, but there are some states starting to require this. But what about prevention? Well, there still isn't a whole lot on prevention. But so child welfare agencies and disability services are now starting to have to think about what works when working with parents with disabilities. When we are thinking about supportive services or preventive services in child welfare or disability services for parents with disabilities, it's important, as always, to look at the research results supporting these types of services. In child welfare services, preventive services can be funded if there is a sufficient evidence base. There are two ways to think of the research base of services for parents with disabilities. There are evidence-based services, which are typically defined as being based on randomized controlled trials or the highest forms of evidence or the most rigorous types of studies. These sometimes can be quasi-experimental designs, which don't involve random assignment, but they have to be really tightly controlled studies. There are also promising practices and these are practices that have a research backing that shows some positive outcomes for interventions. So these are also rigorous studies, but they don't have to have the same type of rigorous design as those designated as evidence-based interventions. There are various places to look for evidence-based interventions, and these have slightly different requirements for what counts as an evidence-based intervention. And the two places in child welfare are the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare, and there's the website listed here, which will also be in our resource guide, and the Title IV-E Prevention Services Clearinghouse, again with this website that you can find in our resource guide. When we're thinking about research, particularly about parents with disabilities, there are several other places that you can go where researchers gather and share information. The first is the International Association for the Scientific Study of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, which is also known as IACID. And IACID has a special interest group on parenting with intellectual disabilities, which is the place where people doing parenting research related to people with disabilities gather and share information. And you can often find the latest research findings being shared within this IACID special interest group. A second place is the Association for Successful Parenting, or it sometimes goes by its tagline, A Chance to Parent. And TASP, as it is known, is also an international organization, but this organization includes researchers, practitioners, advocates, and parents with disabilities themselves. And this is also a great place to go and to find latest information on supports and services for working with parents with disabilities. And finally, there's the National Research Center for Parents with Disabilities, which is hosted at Brandeis University. So IACID and TASP focus specifically on parents with intellectual or developmental disabilities. But the National Resource Center for Parents with Disability is a cross-disability organization that focuses on parents with all types of disabilities. So you can go to this center and you can find resource guides and reports of really current research for parents with a variety of types of disabilities. There are two main areas of intervention research currently related to parents with disabilities. So there is a growing evidence base on parenting skills for parents with disabilities and a smaller body of research related to social networks and parenting supports for parents with disabilities. So the area of parenting skills is the most widely researched type of intervention for supporting parents with disabilities. And this is particularly for supporting parents with intellectual disabilities. There are currently about 40 published studies that explore the effectiveness of these types of parenting skill interventions, where the goal is to increase the individual skills of the parents. And there's a variety of types of parent skill development interventions, ranging from the development of adapted training manuals to game-based interventions, training classes, etc. So there's a number of these, but there are only four main interventions that fall into the category of evidence-based. And the Cochrane reviews, which is like the gold standard for evidence-based interventions, has done a review on parenting skill interventions, and they have found that there are a few of them that fit into this evidence-based category. And these include the four that are listed on this screen. So these are weekly home visits with training, weekly visits with tailored lesson book, STARS, which is a small group training where small groups meet in the community and they're trained on interpersonal skills, such as maternal-child interactions. And then there's video-based intervention programs, which are tailored also to parents with intellectual disabilities, which include video recording sessions of a parent with their children and then providing feedback on their parenting interactions. So these are the evidence-based practices, but there are a number of promising practices that are not based on randomized controlled studies, which show that there are interventions that can have a positive impact on parents in developing their parenting skills. The other type of research area for interventions for working with parents with disabilities are not focused on the individual parent to try to improve the parent's skills, but rather is focusing on the broader social context for the parent with a disability. The most extensively studied approach related to the sort of broader social context is that of structured support groups. For example, researchers have tested a 12-week social support program in Australia and found that participants had increased psychological well-being and perceived social support if they participated in the social support network. This program has been replicated in Canada, and a study in Canada has shown similar results that these types of structured support groups can lead to better outcomes for a parent with a disability. The other type of intervention that falls into this more broader type of intervention than parenting skills is parent-centered planning. And that's what the rest of this module series will focus on, modules 2 and module 3. But briefly, parent-centered planning draws on the person-centered planning approach, which is common in the field of disabilities, but broadens the focus of that from the individual to the parent with the disability and his or her children, with a specific focus on the parent or the parenting role. So, similar to person centered planning, parent centered planning, all aspects focus on what a parent's desires are and preferences of the parent and the supports needed to achieve his or her parenting and family goals. This includes an emphasis on the needs of the parent's child or the children as well, and children can participate as appropriate based on their age. And there's a facilitator who's ideally skilled in group facilitation and knowledgeable at a wide range of community services, such as a social worker who helps in a person-centered planning process for a parent and a supportive community to understand the parenting desires and goals of the parent and the needs of his or her children, and to make both short and long-term goals and to make plans to achieve these goals. So we'll go more into parent-centered planning in modules 2 and 3. But so far, these are the two types of practices that show some promising results from research studies for working with parents with disabilities. So based on the current state of the research for working with parents with disabilities and interventions, there are some practice considerations that are particularly for people working in the child welfare system for working with parents with disabilities. And I will go through each one of these briefly. So the first is the take a strengths approach. So most parents with disabilities can effectively parent their children with appropriate supports. Though parents often encounter professionals who might focus primarily on their weaknesses. Parents can learn parenting skills, even parents with significant intellectual and developmental disabilities, and they can increase their social support networks. So practitioners should employ a strengths approach when supporting these parents. Second is a focus on increasing parenting skills. So most parents with disabilities can learn parenting skills when traditional parent training approaches are adapted based on their individual needs at individual levels of understanding. This might require supplemental training or increased frequency of training, or maybe providing the training in the home or in other familiar environment. But the focus should be on increasing the parent skills. Similarly, parents with disabilities need to focus on increasing their parental supports often. So, parents with disabilities, especially intellectual disabilities, often have small social support networks. And that's not everybody. Some people have excellent networks of families and friends to assist them with their parenting. But, anyways, practitioners can help parents identify their existing parent support networks, find out who is in their network, and then work with this current network to brainstorm ways to expand the social support network of a parent with a disability. Fourth, to provide individually tailored accommodations. So, social workers, child welfare workers, and child welfare agencies are all required by law to make individually tailored modifications to their practices and procedures when working with parents with disabilities, with any type of disability, under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act. And you can see the following website, which is in the resource guide, for more details. Use appropriate communication. Practitioners must ensure that parents with disabilities understand what is communicated to them. Some strategies for effective communication can include establishing rapport, using plain and concrete language, repeating key concepts, listening for comprehension, and using pictorial or other visual types of communication methods. And the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center has a great resource on communicating with parents with disabilities, and you can find this at this website here, which is also in the resource guide. Include disability-related supports directly in the case plans. So case plans for parents with disabilities in the child welfare system should include their disability-related parental support service and accommodation needs right in the plan. And we've done some studies where we found that the disability-related accommodations aren't mentioned anywhere in their case plans. So child welfare agencies and partnering agencies need to include it in the plan. And then the child welfare agencies and the partnering agencies are obliged to provide services and accommodations, which are required under the ADA in Section 504. Seek consultation from disability experts. Practitioners should seek consultation from disability experts and advocates, particularly if you don't have experience in working or providing supports to parents with disabilities. So these experts can be found in state or county disability services offices, centers for independent living, or other local service and advocacy organizations for people with disabilities. So this is always something, if you don't know what the services are, or you're not sure exactly how to work with a parent with the disabilities, ask people who advocate for or people with disabilities themselves to provide you with some consultation. Finally, seek out resources on parenting with a cognitive disability. There are many, many resources geared towards practitioners and family members on the websites of the National Research Center for Parents with Disabilities that I've told you before at Brandeis University, as well as the Association for Successful Parenting. So there are lots of resources for child welfare workers, for parents with disabilities, for disability advocates and service providers on how to support and advocate for and work with parents with disabilities. So that's the end of the practice considerations. You can find all of these resources that I said before on the main module website for this module series. And there's some practice notes, there's a bibliography and links to all the websites that are listed in this module, as well as the parent-centered planning manuals. Modules 2 and 3 of the series will focus on the parent-centered planning, and you can find the manual related to that on the module series. And I hope you join me in modules 2 and 3 to learn more about that. So thank you very much for listening to this module, part 1 of the series. And I hope that you can join me for parts 2 and 3. Thank you for all that you do.